So Daniel Yudkin is a postdoc in the psychology department and the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He completed his PhD in 2017 from NYU. Following this, he works as a postdoc at Yale before taking up his current position at UPenn. Daniel's main focus of study is understanding how people decide between right and wrong and how these decisions impact relationships, organizations, and society. I've been really impressed and excited by his work with the nonprofit More in Common, which has been using insights from social science to understand and bridge political divides, which seem increasingly common, unfortunately, in our society. He's received funding from the John Templeton Foundation and the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. And fun fact, in addition to his research activities, some of which you'll be hearing about today, he actually plays jazz piano, is very good at it, and his EP is actually available in Spotify. So we'll also try and find that link and drop that in the chat too. So thank you so much, and over to you, Daniel.
Thanks, Jim. I really appreciate that. Yeah, you know, when R gets too difficult, a little melody on the piano can always help alleviate the stress. Great. Well, I'm really excited to present some ongoing work that I've been doing over the past few years. Yeah, let me just start sharing my slide. Let's see here.
Daniel, just at the moment, yeah, perfect.
How's that? Looks good? Great.
Yes.
All right. Well, so let me dive in. I don't have tons of time, so I want to just make sure I get through everything. So I'm going to just go ahead here. So as Jim said, I'm going to be speaking today about how relationships can shape moral thinking. And in fact, I'll be talking today about using a large-scale moral repository of moral information to try to answer some of these questions about the relationship between social relationships and moral thinking. So to start, I'd like you to imagine the following situation. Let's just see here. Sorry, I'm just getting the okay. All right, so imagine, you may have never heard this situation before. Imagine that a trolley is hurtling down the tracks, and if you do nothing, it will kill 5 people. You notice there's a switch that you could pull that would divert the trolley and kill only 1 person. I bet you've never thought of that before, but like I said, if you're a good utilitarian, you probably would pull the switch and aim the trolley at the single person, sacrificing that 1 person's life to save 5. Only at that point, after you pull the lever, do you take a closer look and you realize that the person who's been tied to the tracks is your own mother. You desperately try to pull the switch again, but by then it is too late. Now, I think this kind of weird scenario illustrates something that's important about our field. In recent years, moral psychology has been dominated by approaches that ask participants to imagine these somewhat unrealistic scenarios that would rarely happen in everyday life. And these kinds of situations are really useful for understanding certain aspects of our moral thinking. But as some scholars have pointed out, they're also missing out on really important features of our moral lives. And in particular, I think they miss out on the importance of the relationships that we have with each other and how these particular types of relationships can shape our sense of moral obligation. Now, I'm not the first person to make this point. There's been some really cool work by Ryan McManus and Leanne Young and Brian Earp and others that talk about how social relationships can shape moral wrongness judgments. But I think what's been missing from these is a detailed investigation of how these relationships can impact moral thinking in our daily lives. Or as Ted Danson says in The Good Place, and he's echoing the philosopher Thomas Scanlon, who was writing in the 1990s, the real question is, what do we owe to each other? So the research question I'm going to focus on today is, how do social relationships, in particular close relationships, shape moral thinking in daily life? And I'm going to be using a large-scale online investigation of a thread on Reddit. And the thread is called "Am I the Asshole?" Now, I'm sure that many of you have heard of this before, but it's just for those of you who are unfamiliar with it. It is a place where users can write in with stories of situations that's happened in their everyday lives. And then other users can respond to those stories with judgments about of the title question. In other words, are they or are they not the asshole? So here's an example. AITA, that stands for "Am I the Asshole?" for suggesting to my fiance that we make our honeymoon inclusive to our friends. And somebody responded and said, "It's a honeymoon, you fool. She's in for a hell of a marriage, LOL, YTA completely." Somebody else wrote, "Am I the asshole for naming our kids after past cats and not telling my husband?" And somebody wrote, "NTA, that's not the asshole. YTA is you're the asshole. Is it a little weird? Yes, but if he didn't care what their names were and agree that they sound good, then he doesn't really have room to complain." So this is a basic idea of how this thread works. And I think there are several features of this thread that make it ideally suited for the study of moral dilemmas and moral experiences in everyday life. So first of all, it's massive. It has thousands of posts and comments. Second of all, it's theoretically meaningful because this title question, "Am I the asshole?" is really just a proxy, a colloquial proxy for moral approval or disapproval. It's naturalistic, so users are rating and describing these moral dilemmas pseudo-anonymously and without incentives. And it has this unique structure with YTA, or basically a verdict in each comment that can be used as a criterion variable that we could extract to understand how people are evaluating these stories. And so overall, these features make it perhaps the largest repository of moral judgments and experiences that's ever been created. So, okay, so let me just give you a kind of sense of how the data is structured, and then we can talk about how I analyzed it. So you imagine that there's a series of posts that people write. These are these moral stories. And each post has a series of comments. By the way, sorry, I just wanted to, Jim, am I responding to chats as they come up? I just noticed that there's a lot of...
No, sorry, I should clarify that. So the chat is like, ignore the chat. We'll have the QA box, which is for questions that will come at the end. You can ignore the chat for now. Sorry.
All right, I'm going to just plow through, and then at the end we'll say the questions just for the sake of time.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so you imagine these posts have a series of comments, and the comments can be concatenated and averaged to form a sort of an average judgment or an average verdict of these users from each post. And then what we can do is extract certain features from each post and use them to basically to understand how people are evaluating each of the posts. And so what I'm going to be focusing on today are two features. One is the moral principles that are involved in the post. What type of moral content, or what is the dilemma that people are writing about? And the second that I'm going to be looking at is the relational context. Who are people talking about? What relationship do they have to the people they're writing about? So first we needed to extract the data. And so what we did was we used an API called PushShift to extract posts and comments with a date range from 2018 to 2021. We filtered the posts for baseline popularity and the comments for whether ensuring that they contained an evaluation, YTA or NTA. And the ultimate yield of this was 369,000 posts and 11 million comments. We then wanted to identify in each of these 369,000 posts, what are the moral principles that are present in there? And so what we did was use this kind of combination of scholarly insight, human coding, and machine learning. So first we did this qualitative analysis of 500 posts. Translation, that just means it's like me reading 500 posts, and for each post, kind of identifying what type of content, what type of moral principles are present in that post. And so we generated this list of 30 moral principles with an aim of capturing at least 95% of all the posts across this entire corpus. And so here's a sort of a bird's eye view of the different principle types that we extracted. Talked about things like theft, honesty, secret violation, being judgmental, harm, different types of harm. And these can be grouped into about 6 different categories. Now, you'll notice, for those of you who are familiar with moral foundations theory, there's some overlap with moral foundations. For example, things relating to harm, things related to fairness and proportionality. Relational obligation is maybe a type of loyalty, but then there's other things that don't necessarily fit in the moral foundation schema. For example, honesty, emotions, and different social conventions. And I think that is partly because moral foundations theory isn't necessarily equipped to taxonomize every single moral experience that we might have in daily life. And so we needed this additional taxonomy to be able to capture those very varied experiences. So what we did then is we used a deep neural net that we call Roberta. It's essentially just a language classifier that allowed us to essentially extrapolate known principles in each of the posts to the broader corpus. I'm going to kind of like do a very quick version of how this worked, but I'm happy to get into the details of how we did this. So essentially what this allows us to do is take a given text, for example, am I the asshole for checking my girlfriend's phone? And the model is here predicting whether or not this involves a violation of someone's privacy. So in this case, the answer is yes. And so what this allowed us to do is to identify for each of the 369,000 posts, whether or not each of the 30 moral principles that we had identified was present or not present in each of those posts. Then we wanted to extrapolate who is being talked about. What is the relational context of the post? So we used a simple string matching algorithm that just detected the presence of each of these types of relationships, ranging from brother, sibling, son, daughter, kid, child, etc. We mapped these on to larger relationship categories, things to do with acquaintances, extended family, friend, romantic partner. And then in order to measure how close each of these relationship categories was, we recruited a separate sample and asked them to indicate, on average, how close are these relationships to each other. So for example, how close are you to a friend? How close are you to a mother? How close are you to a stranger? And what this allowed us to do is to create an estimate of the social closeness of each of these categories, these relationship categories, and then map the words that were present in each post onto this closeness estimate to create basically just a reflection of how close are people on average to the person they're writing about in the posts in that post. Okay, so now let's go back to this map here, and we can start to examine what questions we were able to answer with these variables extracted. The first thing we can do is just simply look at the moral principles in each post and look at the frequencies here and ask what kinds of moral dilemmas are users writing about most frequently in their daily lives in this corpus. And so here I have a breakdown of just the frequency of moral principles, ranging from most frequent on the bottom to least frequent on the top. And as you can see, the most frequent type of moral situation that people were writing about concerned relational obligations, followed by social conventions, harm and offense, fairness and proportionality, emotions, and honesty. Now, one thing I want to just kind of bracket this with is that I don't necessarily see this as a reflection of the overall moral landscape. There might be a selection effect that's going on here with these types of moral principles that people are writing about. Maybe am I the asshole for selects for certain relational questions that aren't mirrored in everyday life. And I'm happy to talk about some caveats of the data at the end. But this is the frequency of the overall data set. Here's the second question we can ask. We can look at the relationship between moral principles and relational context and say, how do the relationships that are present in the post, and in particular the closeness of those relationships, affect the occurrence of different moral principles? So for this, what I did was simply plot on the x-axis how close are the relationships named in the post, and on the y-axis, how likely is a given post to contain the principle? I apologize if this text is a little bit small. But so on the y-axis, it says basically how likely or what is the frequency or likelihood that the given post contains a principle. On the x-axis is the closeness of the relationships in that post. Now, for honesty, feelings, fairness, and harm, there were some effects that emerged, but these were fairly weak. The most robust effects emerged for social conventions and for relational obligations. In particular, as the closeness of the posts, of the relationships in the post increased, we were more likely to see questions involving the nature of relational obligations and less likely to see questions involving the nature of social conventions. And conversely, social conventions were more likely, questions of social conventions were more likely to appear when people were writing about and talking about distant others. So, you know, and that is not particularly counterintuitive. We would kind of expect that these kinds of moral principles would be present and would be occurring to varying degrees, depending on how close people are to who they're writing about in the post. Finally, we can ask, how do users judge different moral violations in the context of different relationships? So this is basically combining moral principles in relational context, and then including this question of verdict. How are these violations evaluated? And now one thing I'd like to note is that when we start to look at these different principles and how they're evaluated, we can recover certain well-known phenomena in moral psychology. So for example, we find that comparing unintentional harms and intentional harms, posts that have been categorized as one versus the other, we find that intentional harms are more likely to be rated the asshole than unintentional harms. In other words, we're seeing a harsher verdict delivered to posts that include someone who's enacting a harm on purpose than one who's doing it by accident. Now we can look at the relationship between the closeness of the relationships in the posts and how likely a given moral infraction is to be rated the asshole. And again, with honesty, harm, feelings, and fairness, we see some effect, and it's actually trending in the negative direction. But the main difference that I'd like to draw your attention to is, again, this difference between social conventions and relational obligation. As closeness increases, violations of relational obligations are rated worse. As social closeness increases, violations of social conventions are rated less worse or better. And that interaction is significant. And again, it just suggests that we have these differing functions of these different moral principles that are varying in their application across different relational levels of relational closeness. Okay, so just to sum up, I'd like to kind of draw your attention to three main points here. That number one, the most frequent type of moral experience that are described by users in this data set concern relational obligations. The relevance of moral principles depends on social closeness. Some are more relevant or less relevant, depending on how close people are to the person they're writing about. And moral judgments depend on this relationship or this interaction between the type of principle involved and the relationship they have to the person involved. The main kind of limitation I want to point out is just this is a really exploratory finding, and we need to replicate it in controlled experiments. Two implications before I wrap up. Number one, I just want to kind of think about the relationship between this and really well-known work on social closeness and the expanding moral circle done by Peter Singer and others. Singer and others have argued that people tend to have greater moral concern for close and distant others, and this is a well-replicated effect. But the research that I'm presenting here suggests that there are certain cases, certain principles that actually may apply more to distant others than to close others. And overall, this gives kind of validity to what I've started to call the relational toolkit, thinking of morality not as a set of immutable principles, but rather as psychological tools that inform and guide the way that we treat the people around us. So with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators and thank you all for inviting me to speak.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was so interesting. Really cool work. So much to think about here. We've got time for one question, I think, before we move on to AL. I did think someone raised their hand. No. Okay, so in the Q&A, there's one question from Fred Wong, who's just asking what frameworks and assumptions you use for the qualitative coding.
Yeah, so we use an iterated approach where we basically essentially created this list of 30 categories and then made an a priori prediction that in a novel set of posts, we would be able to the 30 principles that we had identified would be able to appropriately capture or describe at least 95% of those, of that out of sample set. It turned out that actually the 30 principles we had identified captured 99% of the posts that we had identified. So it actually overperformed our a priori predictions. So that gave us sort of a basic confidence that the 30 principles that we had identified were indeed adequate for describing the moral corpus that we had extracted.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. So we're going to have to